This week marks 50 years since the shooting of Jimmy Lee Jackson, whose death at the hands of a highway patrolman at a peaceful protest inspired one of the iconic events of the civil rights movement, the Selma, Alabama March. Movement leaders had chosen Selma as the place to dramatize the demand for the right to vote. After Jackson's death, a 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery was planned. Fiery young activist John Lewis was one of the leaders.
We are marching to our state capital to dramatize to our nation and to the world our determination to win first-class citizenship.
But the march was not to be. The protesters ran into trouble soon after they started as they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I had never been to Selma, but with the anniversary of that march looming, I went there yesterday and walked across that bridge with now Congressman John Lewis and asked him what was going through his mind on that fateful day.
We were marching in twos in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion on our way to Montgomery to dramatize to the nation that people wanted to register to vote. I really thought we would be arrested and jailed that day.
When did you realize, when you got to the high point here, that's when you saw all of the law enforcement people down there?
We saw down below the state troopers, and behind the state troopers was the sheriff posse on horseback.
You have to disperse.
And we got to the bottom of the bridge.
See that they turn around and disperse.
And they came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, using tear gas and trampling us with horses.
You were right in the front. And
I was in the very front.
so you were among the first that was hit.
I was the first person to be hit, and I still have the scar on my forehead. And I was knocked down. My legs just went out from under me. I thought I was going to down this bridge. I said to myself, this is the last protest for me.
What happened? Do you remember anything after that?
I remember being back at the church. I don't even recall how I got back to the church, but apparently someone carried me back, and I guess I become conscious, and someone asked me to say something to the audience, and I stood up and said, I don't understand it, how President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote.
And then, in a matter of weeks, of course, he did send the troops, and you were able to make that march to Selma.
There is no cause for pride in what has happened in Selma. Their cause must be our cause too.
Yeah, 2 weeks later, after President Johnson delivered that speech, we did make the march all the way from Selma to Montgomery. It was a sea of humanity marching on this highway.
And you did have people protecting you then, all the way?
All the way, people inspecting the bridges along the way, guarding the camps that night. It was our military. It was our military at its best.
You know, Congressman, a lot of people who were not there, who didn't know how it was, they don't know how different it is now.
Well, it's a different world. Back in 1965, only 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote in this county. You had to go down to the county courthouse. It was the only place you could attempt to register on the first and third Mondays of each month. You had to pass a so-called literacy test. There people were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. People stood in unmovable lines.
And so things are better, but not as good as they ought to be, I guess.
Things are much better, but we're not there yet. We still have problems, and we'll make it. We will get there. Selma was the turning point.
More on our conversation in a minute, and the very different reception John Lewis got when he returned for the first time in 50 years to Selma's courthouse.
Dallas County.
Well, good to be
different
here.
circumstances.
Good to see
Glad
you.
to have you.
Yes, it's so different.
This time, Judge Kimbrough Ballard came out to greet him.
Well, good to have you.
Well,
You're
thank
more than welcome this time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, Judge.
Congressman, a little different reception at this courthouse than back in that day.
Well, it's altogether a vast difference from more than 50 years ago. I remember being arrested near this courthouse, walking around with signs saying "one man, one vote." 1963, 64, 65, it was very hard and very difficult for the average African-American citizen to become a registered voter here in Dallas County and Selma.
Do you think 50 years since then that we will ever be a colorblind society?
I think the day will come. It will come. In the past 50 years, Bob, I must tell you, we have witnessed what I like to call a nonviolent revolution. A revolution of values, a revolution of ideas. I come back to my native state of Alabama. I visit places where I grew up, and I see little black children, little white children, little Latino children in some of those same schools, working and studying together. I went to one little school, and a little white boy had a trench coat on, a backpack, playing me the same way that I marched across the bridge here 50 years ago.
How did you feel when you saw that little
boy
boy portraying you?
It is so gratifying to see these little children, they get it. To see their teachers, black and white teachers, to see their black and white parents. It's not that far from here. And sometimes I feel like crying. Tears of happiness, tears of joy, to see the distance we've come and the progress we've made. When people tell me nothing has changed, I just feel like saying, come and walk in my shoes. I will show you. I would take you to those places.
Yet, for all of the changes, we still have things like Ferguson that happened. We have the incident in New York. How do we get by that? How do we change what we saw happen there?
We can make progress. We can deal with the issue of justice. We can deal with the issue of police and community. In some community, police officers are studying the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. So you bring community and law enforcement together and not sweep the issues under the rug or in some dark corner.
Let me talk to you about what I thought was a rather remarkable speech made by the FBI Director, James Comey. He said, there is a disconnect between law enforcement and minority communities, and he said, all of us, black and white, carry various biases around with us. What do you think about what he said?
It's a profound statement, profound speech. And I think it took raw courage, not anything short of raw courage, for the director of the FBI to be able to say something like that. It is very encouraging to have this federal official. When you look back to the 50s and the 60s, when the FBI spied on Martin Luther King Jr., when the FBI was not doing the job that it should have been doing, that's hope. Give me hope.
At another point in the speech, he said, we cannot let it drift away and talk about it on another day. Have we let Ferguson drift away in some of these other incidents?
I think we have let Ferguson drift away, and we only operate for that moment. We just cannot operate and think about Ferguson and some other communities for a day or for a week or maybe a few months. We have to deal with it here and now. If not, there will be other Ferguson.
Do you think those brave people who came across that bridge with you, do you think they realized the impact that that day would have?
When we were marching across that bridge, just simple saying people wanted to register to vote, wanted to participate in the democratic process. I don't think as a group we had any idea that our marching feet across that bridge would have such an impact 50 years later. If it hadn't been for that march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, there would be no Barack Obama as President of the United States of America.
Congressman, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for having me.